everybody online or here in the Matrix room. I am delighted to welcome you today and to be able to host Professor Julia Lane's lecture, Democratizing Our Data. Today's program is the first of our events happening this fall semester, and it is co-sponsored by UC Berkeley's D-Lab and the Social Science Matrix. We are looking forward to an exciting semester of talks, book salons, and panels on various current hot topics. We have panels, we're organizing panels on Afghanistan, non-citizenship, critical infrastructures, new directions in the study of policing, and on online misogyny. So please check the Matrix website and sign up for our newsletter to get updates on these events and many more. Now, before we proceed, let me briefly review some housekeeping items. So a quick note about the format of today's panel. We'll have a brief introduction and the speaker will lecture for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session. So members of the online audience may submit questions and comments through the Q&A feature throughout the conversation. And of course, you can find that feature by now. You should be used to it at the bottom of your Zoom window. And please note that you will not be able to see other people's questions posted on Zoom. If you're having AV troubles, please send us a message through the chat function. And finally, this session is recorded and will be made available on the Matrix website. So without further ado, let me introduce first our moderator, who will introduce our speaker. So Claudia von Vacano is the executive director of the D-Lab and the Digital Humanities at Berkeley, and is on the boards of the Social Science Matrix and Berkeley Center for New Media. She has worked on policy and educational administration since 2000, and at the UC Office of the President and UC Berkeley since 2008. She's currently on leave from Berkeley at Cornell, but today she happens to be here. So thank you, Claudia, and welcome, Professor Lane.
Thank you so much, Marianne. It's so exciting to be here today. And I am so privileged to be able to introduce Julia Lane, professor at the NYU Wagner Graduate School of Public Service and at the NYU Center for Urban Science and Progress, and a NYU Provostial Fellow for Innovation Analytics. Professor Lane is also the co-founder and director of the Coleridge Initiative, a nonprofit that is working with governments to ensure that data are used more effectively for decision-making. Julia has published over 80 articles in leading economic journals and authored or edited 10 books. She has been the recipient of over 70 million in grants from foundations such as the National Science Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, the Russell Sage Foundation, among many. Julia is the recipient of the 2017 Warren E. Miller Award, 2014 Julius Siskin Award, and the 2014 Roger Harriot Award. And it's just a really such a personal honor and pleasure and privilege, because I have been so incredibly impressed by Julia's dedication to public service and making really the impossible happen. And the partnership that she has forged with California has been really unprecedented, and is really something that I want to thank you for. So without further ado, Julia Lane.
Well, back at you all, because it takes two to make a partnership. So it's been an honor to work with you guys as well. So this is the outline of what I'm going to do. This is really weird. So, I mean, this is my first live gig for almost 2 years. So I'm going to give you some context for the work that I've been doing with you guys. Put it into kind of a broader, I think, quite disruptive approach. And I'm just thrilled. We've been building these partnerships across the country. Obviously, this is a really big and important one. California is, as you may have noticed, a big and important state. So, but you know, so it's just wonderful to have Berkeley involved in this. So here's the context. You may have noticed that data is a thing, and you may also have noticed that our capacity to create and produce public data and make it accessible has not kept pace with the private sector. And I'm going to talk a lot about the federal statistical system, but it's true throughout government. And part of what we're trying to do here is we're trying to effect disruptive change. Okay, so kind of a little bit of backstory here. Back in 1996, 97, I went as a research fellow to the Census Bureau because I had this idea about building linked employer-employee data for the United States and linking it using UI wage records and tax data and combining it with data from multiple different agencies. That turned into the LEHD program, the Longitudinal Employer Household Dynamics program. That was and still is the only national statistical program started by a researcher. And it's been, I'm going to say, transformative. It was a hell of a lot of work. So essentially it took universe wage record data from which are produced by all firms, for all jobs, for all workers in the covered sector, in all 50 states. It combined them with tax data, IRS W-2 records, with SSA data, with census data, with HHS data, with Department of Labor data, 6 federal agencies, 50 states, confidential microdata. It's been used for all kinds of stuff. Wait, you say, well, didn't we just go through the 2020 census still by hand, effectively, not using really administrative records? The reason I'm pointing this out was in 1996, 97, the people I partnered with were people at the Administrative Records Research staff who were thinking about how can we use administrative records for the census. 20 years later, nothing's happened. There have been innumerable academy studies. And you physically, and I'm not telling Patty anything you don't know, you still physically have to go on site to a secure facility to access those data. And that's been a massive change. But 15 years ago, I created the NORC Remote Access Data Enclave. So it's like, it's not, we didn't know how to do things. It's just that nothing's happened in 25 years. And so, you know, I got to thinking about there are good people at all levels of government. And I was at OMB and we were trying to figure out how to do the federal data strategy and so on. And I got to thinking, why isn't anything changing? And I went back and I looked at Janet Norwood's Organizing to Count book, which she wrote in 1995. And it was like reading another discussion about why things can't get done. Nothing's changed. And if you think about it, I'm a labor economist, so I think a lot about labor data. David Card wrote this great piece. Why are we measuring unemployment and employment, a binary measure which is driving a huge amount of policy, based on a measure that was developed in the 1930s, measures of GDP that developed for the Cold War and for the Great Depression? It makes no sense. Why can't we innovate? Why can't we change? Why can't we do things differently? And so that's basically where I started thinking for the book. So back in the day, we had data collected centrally on the weather system in Washington. And in 1900, Washington said, there's a storm that's heading for Florida. It ended up in Texas, and it's still the single biggest national disaster in the US. Up to 12,000 Americans killed. After that, the National Weather Service changed. What they did was they pushed out data collection and dissemination to local areas. So now, instead of everything getting collected nationally, it's still collected nationally, but the state, local, regional offices give information that is customized to provide information every hour, every minute if you want. And it's very rich information. It's not this binary measure that's set up in Washington. It's not just a binary measure of unemployment and employment. Think about translating it. You could get rich measures of how long people are employed, how many jobs do they have to have, what level of income do they get? Are they getting, all kinds of new ideas? What was their industry? What's their race? What's their sex? What's their gender? It's not just collected by surveys for just a few people. And how can we effect that change? So part of it is state, local, bottom-up decision-making and data collection and generation. And then the other part of it is the role of the universities. So back in the 1880s, farmers had problems. They were trying to figure out how to solve them. They didn't know how to learn about how to solve those problems. So what they did was they set up farmers' institutes so they could learn from each other. And over time, that evolved into the National Land Grant System, the role of the universities and the farmers' institutes in training each other, learning from each other, and building capacity in the Ag Extension Program. So, I kind of see the university system as, when we're rethinking how to collect and make use of data in the United States, the university system as being key, a partnership. And so it's really interesting to use the term partnership. Very much what we have with the Ag Extension Program. You've got farmers' institutes who worked with the farmers and built a training approach like that. And that's kind of what I talk about in the book. So what I'm going to talk about today is kind of, we're in a moment. And one of the things I've learned, part of the reason I work so hard, is windows open and windows close. The window's wide open right now, and so we need to move. So that's why, my nickname when I was a waitress was Express Lane, so it's still Express Lane. So 2016, there was this Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking that was set up. And OMB gave census money to set up Administrative Records Clearinghouse. Census turned to me because I built the Data Enclave and I was building one at NYU, and said, would you be willing to build a secure environment? And I said, well, first of all, we're not going to call it a clearinghouse, we're going to call it a facility. And secondly, they didn't give me 10 million, they gave me 2.5 million. But said, okay, we can build it. I said, the challenge is that putting data in a secure environment is necessary but not sufficient. If we had just put in the California data and said, here it is, how useful would that have been? You've got to create products that have value to the agencies, and you've got to engage the state agencies who know and understand the data. Catherine Elliott, for example, and Liberty, who know and who understand the data. You need to engage them in building the capacity. So what we did was we did two things. We built both the secure environment, the Administrative Data Research Facility, not clearinghouse, facility, and the training programs. So that was kind of the basic idea here. And so I'm going to talk about three pieces. One is the secure environment that got turned into the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act. The second is the learning agendas that came up with it. And then the third is figuring out what data are available and building a community around it. So first, build a secure environment. Second, build the workforce capacity. Third, find out who else has done the work. You'll remember from the California class that we did, people would say, well, who else has worked on this? And it was all ad hoc and manual. It was like, well, Catherine knows this, or Liberty knows this, or so-and-so knows this. That's a hell of a way to run a ship, right? So the third piece is, how do we build a community infrastructure around data, and Amazon.com for data? And that's what that third piece is. So I'm going to talk about that if I get time. So just going to walk you through the secure environment. So that's the Foundations Act. So who knew? We built this environment in the cloud back in 2016, 2017. That was a really risky step because everyone was like, oh, it has to be on a secure server and states will never agree to be on the cloud. But it turned out to be magic, dumb luck. And because what it meant is state agencies can share data and provide access without physically having to ship the data anyway. It just goes onto a server, they control it, part of the data stewardship is going to be on. And then of course with COVID, so many of the physical environments were not usable. So we, like National Center for Education Statistics, for example, they had a whole bunch of graduate students and postdocs and junior faculty were marooned because they couldn't get to the cold rooms. So NCS did a pilot with us for 50 graduate students. And then now they're opening it up to all of their researchers. You could see a whole bunch of different things coming in. We just signed an agreement with NDNH. So we also have, so this was driven not by us, but by agency interests. So here's where we are currently on the different states. So Illinois was a leader. It was a leader with LEHD, strong personal relationships. I talk about that in the book as well. And they wanted to combine corrections, TANF, and workforce data because the heads of those three agencies had a whole bunch of questions that need to be answered. So this was question driven. So we ran our first set of classes around Illinois data, and then people got really excited. And you could see how the states are using us at the host. So just to be clear, we don't own any of this data. It's not ours. The agencies control it and own it. And what they've now started to have developing is a Midwest collaborative of 10 states. So what they're building, and I'm not going to go into this in any more detail because of time limitations, they're building an unemployment to reemployment portal so that the governor's office, the unemployment claims data come in on a Monday. It then gets cleaned, sent to us Thursday morning. We have information about who's getting jobs, where they are on benefits, what by education, occupation, and so on, age, race, ethnicity, granular location. It's in the governor's office and the workforce board, so they can make decisions on it immediately, not on the first Friday of every month, right? And it's highly granular. It's not in Illinois, you maybe, if you're looking at survey data, it's maybe 100 people. But here it's millions that you can track. And so those dashboards are being produced for a whole bunch of states. And we're just measuring reemployment information about the quality of the jobs they're getting and where they're getting reemployed. So the potential here, as you can imagine, is massive. Arkansas is in with Tennessee, Kentucky, they're looking at cross-state flows. So it's been incredibly successful. Just summarizing what the ADRF does. What's the value proposition for the agencies? So the first thing is a secure environment. So the FedRAMP, the cloud, is a secure environment, and think of it as city walls. And then agencies can share data. They control their house inside those city walls. The 5 safes is safe project. That's why it's not a clearinghouse, it's a facility. They control the project. Safe people. Safe settings, FedRAMP. Safe data, the data are de-identified, and safe export. So it's aggregated before it's released. Because once it's here, if states want to agree on a project like unemployment to reemployment or education to workforce transitions or whatever, they can agree on a project. They're building these collaborative agreements because obviously the legal part's non-trivial, and they can work in that setup. So the class is kind of the initial step, but you can imagine as California builds out, crossing across agency lines. So we've done education, human services, and workforce that can get expanded. You can include criminal justice data, which is what Dave and I were talking about at breakfast. So what's the value proposition? Okay, what's the value proposition for researchers? Because obviously, much so I'm an academic, much so I love academics, spending their careers helping states is not the way to tenure and promotion. So there has to be a value proposition for researchers as well. And so obviously data, so much of what we do in science at all levels is data driven. So the advantage here is, and of course we're building this plane as we're flying it. So this is ARF version 3. But what you're able to do is you land in, it's a Windows environment. We're building collaborative tools and making it a whole lot more user-friendly. And you'll see what I'm talking about when we get to the collaboration aspect, because the commenting in the data catalog. The advantage of being in AWS is you don't have a fixed environment. You can set your CPU, you can set your storage, you can set your compute. You can look up, and the way we built it, right? So democratizing data means access that is democratic. And much so I love the FSRDC system. If I'm a woman at home with kids and I'm in a small university, the cost of me coming in and sitting physically in FSRDC is huge. So, and then the price tag is huge. So how can we drive that down so that data access is democratized? The pricing calculator is on the AWS site. We charge a 25% overhead. So you'll see what that translates into here. So here's the example for USDA. Now for the education researchers, you're talking about much smaller data sets. So it's about $265 a year to sign up. But this is the cost to set up a project. And this is the annual cost with this. We kind of have to do tiered pricing because you can't do, immediate. It's kind of an iPhone type of approach, but that's the structure. So that is doable. So now let's talk about workforce capacity. So this is this piece. This is that vision of building the relationship between state universities and state agencies. And that, I'm an economist, so I keep thinking about the value proposition. Value proposition to state agencies is it's very hard for them to hire and retain staff. So building the capacity of their existing staff, plus potentially building a flow of trained people into their into the state agencies is really a big plus. For the universities, for graduate students and postdocs and faculty to be working on the data, it's a new source of information. Plus, the potential for many of the staff to get hired in. So to me, this makes sense. And you can see, we started these classes, who knew that they were going to be such a big deal? Because we did it just as a one-off to inform the decision-making of the commission. But you can see how it's expanded. And actually, this is out of date because we're now close to 800. But and I'm not telling sociologists anything you don't know, but the strength of weak ties, right? So it has expanded to a degree. Like last year, we taught 4 classes. This year, it's been 12. And we've been dying. We can't cope. You're familiar with the structure of the California class. This is very similar. Now, we expect to be developing and changing this as we build more with the university. So it's evolved quite a bit since we first started, but obviously we had to go to Zoom. There are probably many different ways in which we could do things differently. And I'm sure that as we work more with our partners in the universities, people will come up with different approaches, going to more modules, maybe a hybrid, some classes in person, some classes not. What we want to do is build a national network where we bring everyone together once a year, and it's a bottom. The whole idea here is democratizing, bottom up. And so people say, well, what are you doing next? And it's going to be, well, what are we doing next? What are we doing? What are we as a community doing to change things? I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but the way in which the class is designed is around a question that's of interest both to the universities and to the agencies. And it's got to have policy relevance. I mean, we spent quite a bit of time working with the agencies to say, how does this matter? So again, from the federal point of view, you know, I sit on this advisory committee for the implementation of the next part of the Foundations Act. And so very much at the core of this is evaluation. And as I keep saying, you don't want to have evaluation like 4 years after it, or in the case of some of my papers, 15 years. But they don't want the evaluation done at academic speed, you know? So we're talking about a labor crisis now, certainly at the lower income end. If we're implementing short-term certificate training programs, you know, let's get signals back now. If there are things that are working for foster use, let's have even just descriptive statistics. It doesn't have to be a super formal randomized controlled trial. So the way in which we do this, and again, we're open to reworking and so on, but it has been very successful, is they spend a lot of time formulating the question, and it feels like wasted time to them, but then at the end, they feel like it was actually useful time, or a lot of them do. Because just learning how to think through what you can do, what you can't do, getting down here and saying, oh my God, that doesn't work, I've got to go back, research, right? So it's very difficult because they're in a new environment, they're learning to work with teams, data science is a team sport. They're learning how to think through what you can and can't do. Learning what you can't do is as important as learning what you can do. And then they're also learning new tools. They're learning how to collaborate. They're constantly frustrated by the access restrictions. And I'm going to say, I don't think it's a bad thing. I think that's a feature, not a bug. You should always be thinking that you're dealing with confidential data on human beings, and it should be hard. So you need, you know, making it easier, I'm not convinced is the right way to go about it. But anyway, so that's kind of the structure. And then they obviously, part of the reason I'm here is that tomorrow, the California teams are going to be presenting. Their bosses are going to come. And with any luck, as Patty says, this is the beginning of a conversation. You now have 25 people in the state who have been working with the university who say, oh my God, I can think about things differently and I can do things differently. So, you know, and that's kind of the feedback that we get, that it has been good. And so here's the goal. Instead of the unemployment numbers being delivered from Washington, DC once a month, because we're empowering people at the local level, at the state level, to develop measures that make sense out of classes like this. You could have data that is being produced like we're doing now with Illinois and with the other states on a much faster, timelier, and more useful basis, just like we do with the weather. So then the last piece is search and discovery. So secure environment, check. Training program, check. All still works in progress, but getting there. But then we run into the situation where people land on a data set and they say, well, who else has worked on it? How can we build an Amazon.com around data? Remember, we're in a moment. This is Title II of the Foundations Act. And I'm sitting on this committee. I'm also on the National AI Task Force. And the agencies have been charged with doing this, and they only have manual and ad hoc approaches to doing it. So how are we going to do this? Well, obviously you can use tools that will show you how to search by how data are produced. That's what we currently do. This is a picture. I'm still very proud of it because it does tell you a lot about the data. And you guys didn't have access to this because we've just been putting it in, but that's part of ADRF 3. So in a few weeks, the new classes are going to have this kind of information that they can go into. But imagine if we could figure out how data are being used. So I could find out who has worked with the data. Now, we've tried to make data open before. When I was first at NSF, Obama came in and they pushed for this open data. And so agencies just put out a vomit of data. But imagine if we could create an Amazon.com for data. So, obviously I love the Simon Winchester's books. If you have anything to read on data and measurement, this is a great book. Now take a look at what happens. The basics here are, how was the book produced? What's the name of the book? What's the author? What's the ISBN number? So, 20 years ago when I went to Barnes & Noble or to Politics and Prose, I'd go into a store and I'd say, I like this book. What other books are like this? And there'd be a human being who would go around and say, here's other books you might like. One reason why Jeff Bezos is a gazillionaire is he figured out how to get people to provide comments and information and related books. Now translate that into data sets. And that's the last piece of this disruptive activity. So what we really want to do is we need to read 80 million publications, because anyone who writes an empirical piece, they say somewhere, this is the data set that we used. Once we've found the data sets in publications, then we know the topics, we know the authors, and the entire ecosystem, and we can use that to document the value of a data set, which is what agencies are being charged to do. So easy, right? If you take a look at any paper, and this is one example, I'm picking on myself here. Here I am, I'm saying I use the LEHD data. Not in the references, not anywhere. But when you read on it, when you read this, there's some semantic flags in there. It says data and measurement. And it says something about data. So it seemed to us, computer scientists, machine learning and natural language processing people could build tools to read publications. And of course, I'm going to look at the scientific corpus, but there's no reason why we can't use this inside the ADRF to have, or any data facility, to find out who else is working on what projects. So I get ideas as they're coming, not just ideas after they've been published, or to look at scientific publications inside the government or on the Federal Register or any text corpus. So anyway, $5 million later, and actually, when you were saying it's $70 million was a long time ago, I'm probably closer to 200 million at this point. But anyway, $5 million later, with funding from Schmidt and Sloan and USDA and Overdeck and a bunch of other people, this is the third competition we ran. You find out what you did wrong each time. And so we ran a Kaggle competition in which we challenge the data science community. Can you find publications in data sets? Sorry, data sets inside publications. We had 1,600 teams throughout the country. These are the winners. Everything that they did is public. So you can apply these ML tools. There's actually 3 different ways. It turns out this is a super interesting and rich set of questions. So they got super excited. But yes, we can find data sets in publications. We get a prediction score, but this is still a little bit of a dead letter, because what we want to do is actually get the research community to say, but you missed me, right? So we can apply the machine learning model to a particular corpus, and we're working with some publishers to do this. But you're still not going to know if you got it right until you get that human-computer interaction, which is the last piece I'm going to talk about. So what does this buy you, by the way? This is the way in which data are currently reported on both data.gov and on the ERS website. How exciting is that? Really gets you going, right? If you link it to publications, because what we're doing, we were able to read a whole bunch of, and this was just a test, open source publications. This is how it's used. This is how it's produced. So that's the old borders. This is the Amazon.com. That's how it's used. So now what we're building is ways of clicking on this. So up come the population. Who's used those urban continuum codes to look at African American? And by the way, what's not there? When we did the same thing with the survey of earned doctorates, and I'm teaching a class to UNCF and Excellencia students, United Negro College Fund and Hispanic serving institutions. I showed them the SED, and it's got women and engineering and science and so on. What wasn't there on how the SED, survey of earned doctorate, was being used, what wasn't there, which I didn't realize until I showed it to them, African American. No one is using the SED, at least in the corpus that we were looking at, to study African American granting of STEM degrees. So, you know, it's as much as identifying where a hell of a lot of stuff's been done as where things have not been used. You'll see that there's some stuff in there on environmental quality and climate change. But anyway, I could go on. So, you know, how can we build that feedback loop? When I cut and pasted this, oh, it's going. You could get people to correct. So here's another visualization. You put it up. The federal agencies put it up on their website. And Dave Harding sits there and says, wait a minute. You're saying you put a leaderboard up and I'm not there? I'm going to tell them that they got it wrong. And not only that, but I'm going to give them the information. So building in the engagement of the research community so that it's incentive compatible. If I go to Dave and I'm at NSF and I say, will you please upload all your information? What do you do? Right? If, however, I say to Dave, you know, here, this is a very visible thing and you're not famous enough to be on here, what are you going to do? I'm going to correct you. So that's where we're thinking. And I think that's going to be absolutely critical to making this a living thing, which is what Amazon.com did. So what are our next steps? This is a conference we're running around the rich context. And I should have cut and pasted the data challenge, but I didn't. But I was, but that's the human-computer interaction piece and getting the researchers to be involved. But then much more in the center of things is what's going on with the commission, the recommendation of the Hart-Potok report, which is that there be an FFRDC set up at NSF, funding for NSF that includes the FFRDC. There's a national lab. this AI task force, which I'm also on, which is doing it, and the potential role here for something like the D-Lab and D-Labs throughout the country. So it's going to drive that bottom-up approach. So that's a vision. I'll shut up.
So there is already one question from online. Sure. I got this. So there's a question that has come in from Professor Karen Chappell. And the question, yeah, she says a question from your old friend and fan. What is the magic Julia Lane sauce that persuades government agencies to share their data with you? Exclamation mark and question marks. We're all very impressed. It seems like this labor-intensive process could be a major barrier to scaling up.
Yeah, that's right. And I'd like to say it's my good looks, brains, and personality, but you weren't going to buy that for a minute, right, Karen? It's not. So I don't think there's anything magic, to be honest. It is, we didn't create this. It was the value proposition that created it. So the training classes turned out to be magic, and you've seen that already. They're magic because it's a hell of a lot of work to get it up and started, but in combination with the ADRF, because then agencies can securely put their data in. They control it, not my data. I'm just the public utility. So that's one piece. They control it. Then the second piece is the training and building that community. I think it's that simple. And that the agencies own it. The value proposition comes from the agency. It's driven bottom up. No one is telling, like, in Berkeley, you've got the TV station every day putting out information about the weather. No one is telling them how to produce that. They're producing it because that's what produces value to their constituency. And the state agencies are doing the same. So the value proposition's been huge.
There's a question here from the live audience.
Oh.
You keep that one so you can answer.
Oh.
Thanks for the really interesting talk. We talked a lot about state data, a little bit about federal data. Where do you see kind of county level data, city level data, or even private sector data that social scientists and policymakers are increasingly using, sort of fitting into these plans in the framework?
That's a great question. So a lot of it's just been bandwidth at this point. We actually work pretty closely with a number of New York City and City of Chicago. We have Cook County data and so on. So it's just a matter of enough time to get things set up. But we actually, in the first few years, we had a lot of people from the cities and counties, LA County, and up Washington, Seattle, King County. So there's nothing in principle. Private sector as well, MasterCard, ADP, LinkedIn. I just want the grounding to be public data and public value. And then the other, I don't want it to turn into something that's just another vehicle for private sector data. Those are a dime a dozen. But there's no reason, there's such massive value added from being able to government agencies being able to add in these rich other sources, that I think it's a really important piece. But it took 20 years to build LEHD. This is going to be an ongoing project, and it's going to take a village.
I have a question. I'm wondering about your ongoing partnership or relationship with the FSRDC, just because everything that you're doing is so innovative, and I know that there's need for that kind of innovation. And are you continuing? You mentioned FSRDC in the past, but I'm curious if you have future
Oh, very much. Like when we built the North Data Enclave, it was very much hoping that that remote approach, because we had a lot of federal data inside the North Data Enclave as well. And we still do, well, North still does. And I believe the FSRDCs have moved to an online. You know, I'm very much hoping that I think what we're doing is extremely complementary. Good heavens, there's more than enough data and interest and capacity to go around. So I see it as very complementary. Amy O'Hara, obviously, who you know, who's on the FSRDCs for Georgetown, she's been very involved in making suggestions for the FSRDCs are a tremendous resource. I'd like to see that grow and be used as much as possible. I do think they're going to have to go to more of a remote model, though. I don't know what your thinking is. Patty, you're probably got some thoughts about the FSRDCs, how this complements.
Well, I do know they have their online pilot program.
Right.
So I see that as a complement, and the more players in the space, the better the space gets.
Yes,
Um,
I would like to become obsolete, right?
But I did have a question for you that was related to geography, being a geographer myself. And that is, I can understand you're going into a state like California and talking to the different state agencies and building out a training like the one we're currently engaged in. But what is that barrier? How big is that leap to a regional partnership? Is that a natural outcome of this work, or is that just you really have to lean in to get there?
Leaning in. So the Midwest Collaborative was driven by the state interest because they recognized they had a regional economy. So I think it was Indiana that started it, and they said, look, we had classes by that type in Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, Missouri. And they said, so much value from looking at flows across state lines. Why don't we just create a Midwest Collaborative? And so the state agencies did. And now that's some people who were in the New Jersey class, in the OSU class, Aaron, remember the New Jersey? They went off and they started the New Jersey class, and now they're pulling in New York, Connecticut, and a bunch of those states. And then Kentucky and Tennessee kind of came in, and then they said, man, we'd really like to do a Southern Collaborative, and now Texas and Arkansas. So it's kind of this viral approach that you saw in the pictures. Now, we had hoped, as you know, with the California class to bring Washington State in, and we had 2 people from the state of Washington who were great in the class. And I would imagine that a Western Collaborative would form. It's a little bit different for California because it's so big in its own right. But there are starting to be some flows into and out of California into other states in the West. So I expect that conversation to continue. But it's state driven. We kind of facilitate it. And but we don't drive that.
So any final questions from the audience here? Marion?
Thank you for a wonderful talk. So I have a question about sort of,
You know, it turns out with the mask, you can't breathe.
you can see my,
So I'm sucking
glasses
out.
coming out repeatedly.
Because I'm not.
So I wanted to ask a question about alternative kinds of data. You know, it seems that you know, with new you know, with the abundance of data, there's sort of profound transformation in the way in which we can measure, you know, traditional indicators. I mean, I know that for certain countries, people are using, you know, electricity consumption. They are using, so all of this. There's also alternative measures for inflation and so on. So I'm wondering how you're thinking about that and how that, you know, features in your very ambitious plan too. So.
Well, no, I'm not going to say mine. Let's say our very ambitious, because it's not going to be just Julia Lane. I mean, so that's a fabulous question. So in the book, I talk about Simon Kuznets, you know, coming in we had the Great Depression, the way in which Herbert Hoover tried to track what was happening with output was freight loadings on trains. That was his measure. And so Simon Kuznets came in and brought a team from the NBR and sat in the Department of Commerce, or Bureau of Commerce, or whatever it was back then. And they figured out how to pull data together in what was then a very rigorous way in order to create an indicator like GDP. Now, Simon Kuznets didn't think it should be used as a measure of wealth or he recognized the limitations, but it was something that was good in the 1930s. And we're still using almost 100 years later. But anyway, the point here is not only do we have to come up with new measures, but the essence of science is replication. So for example, I might come up with a measure from the Billion Prices Project or from or of economic activity, but what about what we're missing, right? So the things that we worry about for the 3-1, if we do everything by 311 calls, who is not calling 311? Right, babies don't call. Probably, I'm using a New York example, little old ladies on the Upper East Side call, but people on the Lower East Side ain't gonna call, right? So what biases do we have? And that's where the scientists, the research community, come in and have an argument about the robustness of the measures, but we absolutely have to have different measures of unemployment, of economic activity, and so on. Not just as academic papers, which we do now, which are not getting picked up. And I talked about that in the CRAW. We have lots of, CRAW, the National Academies reports, and people pontificating off in their own little echo chamber. It needs to be grounded by what's going to get taken up and used. But that's exactly right. It's data and measurement. And that Simon Winchester book is a really good example.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the partnership.